Everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon for the third event of the 2025-2026 Rothenberg Healthcare Law and Policy Speaker Series. For those of you also in the cold and snowy parts of the world, we are especially glad that you can safely join this virtual event. If you joined us in the fall, you will know that this year's series has a focus on the future of food, drug, and medical device regulation. Our 2025 speakers provided wonderful insights into this evolving area, starting with Rachel Sachs, a professor of law at the Washington University School of Law in St. Louis, who spoke on regulating health technologies in a post-FDA world. And she was followed in November by Professor Patty Zettler of the Ohio State University's Moritz College of Law, who spoke on how FDA's crisis is everyone's crisis, the past, present, and future of FDA reform. This afternoon, we are thrilled to continue delving into this important topic with a top thinker in this area. But before we turn it over to Dr. Peter Lurie, our distinguished guest, I just want to briefly introduce myself and this speaker series. If this is your first time joining, a special welcome to you. My name is Diane Hoffman. I'm on the faculty here at University of Maryland, Carey School of Law, where I direct the Law and Healthcare program. The Rothenberg Speaker Series began during the height of the COVID pandemic, and it was a way for us to maintain a connection with our health law community, and it has since evolved into a dynamic virtual convening space. Now it's in its sixth annual iteration, and we continue to convene leading scholars and practitioners of health law, policymakers, scientists, and advocates to create opportunities for our community to engage with the most urgent questions in health law and policy. The series is sustained through the generous support of the Karen Rothenberg and Jeffrey Seltzer Law and Healthcare Program Endowment. Professor Rothenberg, our former dean and longtime director and founder of the Law and Healthcare Program, established the groundwork for this initiative, and we're glad to continue advancing the vision. And now I'm truly honored to welcome this afternoon's speaker, Dr. Peter Lurie, the president and executive director of the Center for Science in the Public Interest, or CSPI. In this role, he oversees national, state, and local policy and advocacy, legislative and regulatory affairs, agricultural biotechnology, and litigation. He also leads CSPI's business, science, and communication activities and is the executive editor of Nutrition Action. And I'm going to just pause here a second and to interject my plug for becoming a member of CSPI. He didn't ask me to do this, but I have been a member for at least the last half dozen years, and the organization does just great work, and I look forward to receiving and reading their newsletter and learning about all the work that they're doing, trying to make sure FDA is keeping our food safe and giving correct information to consumers. And I know it provides the latest and scientifically based information about food and nutrition. But back to my introduction of Dr. Lurie. So prior to joining CSPI, he was the Associate Commissioner for Public Health Strategy and Analysis at the Food and Drug Administration, where he worked on antimicrobial resistance, transparency, caffeinated beverages, arsenic and rice, fish consumption by pregnant and nursing women, expanded access to investigational drugs, and prescription drug abuse. Prior to that, he was Deputy Director of Public Citizens Health Research Group, where he addressed drug and device issues, co-authored the organization's book, Worst Pills, Best Pills, which is a consumer guide to medications, and led efforts to reduce worker exposure to hexavalent chromium and beryllium. Earlier, as a faculty member at the University of California, San Francisco, and the University of Michigan, he studied needle exchange programs, ethical aspects of mother-to-infant HIV transmission studies, and other HIV policy issues domestically and abroad. It's hard to think of anyone more fitting to talk on today's important topic, which is the future of food and nutrition regulation. After his talk, he will take questions from the comments, so please feel free to drop any inquiries you have for Dr. Lurie in the chat. And one more thing, if you notice that Dr. Lurie has a slight accent, that's because he's originally from South Africa. And now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Peter Lurie.
Great. Well, Diane, thank you for having me. Dr. Rothenberg, thank you for sponsoring this series and for coming along to see who speaks. That's great. I am the head of CSPI, and I'm going to speak today on the future of food and nutrition regulation. In order to do that, I will share my screen, and hopefully Diane will confirm that everything is working just right, which I think will be the case right about now. Right. So that should be good, right? Think we're good to go? Right. Okay, great. So I will launch in. And again, thank you for having me. So the topic is the future of food and nutrition regulation. It's the best way to advance this like this. And today I'm going to hit basically four topics. Talk a little bit about CSPI, what we do. Diane's given a nice introduction already, but I'll provide a little bit more information. And then three other topics that relate to food. There are much more we can talk about, and we can get into some of those during the question and answer session when I'm done. But the ones that I've identified for today are the so-called Make America Healthy Again, or MAHA movement, and what they've been up to. Regulation of food additives, which includes, in particular, something called GRAS. I'll explain what that is. And finally, the recently released dietary guidelines for Americans. So we'll start off by talking a little bit about CSPI. This is our mission statement. We envision a healthy population with a reduced impact and burden of preventable diseases and an equitable food system that makes healthy, sustainable food accessible to all. So you can tell that we have a public health orientation focused on the prevention of disease, not just about, say, consumption of food or the like, or even the production of food. Our object is the prevention of disease. So very much a public health frame with a focus on equity and sustainability. We were founded by my predecessor, Mike Jacobson, in 1971, so over 50 years ago. Our tagline is "Your Food and Health Watchdog." We're funded by that nutrition action that Diane referred to, and then by donors, large and small, who offer small contributions, and then by grants from appropriate corporations, foundations. Importantly, we take very little money from the federal government, only for research and really in very small amounts, and no money whatsoever from corporations. So we think and hope that that provides us with an ability to speak the truth in an unrestricted fashion. So I like to think about the way the CSPI's impact in kind of two ways. Now you see it is one, and now you don't is another. So here are the things that you can see where the next time you go to a restaurant or to a retail outlet, you might see something that will remind you, oh, that guy from CSPI, he had something to do with this. If you take a look at the nutrition facts label, for example, that's one of the things that we advocated for, starting back in 1994. Those were implemented. They've been revised since, and they revised most recently to include this trans fat line. We'll get back to this one. You'll notice it says 0 grams, a larger calorie count, and then an added sugar line over here. So these are new innovations from, I want to say, about 2016, 17. And we worked on that actually. I worked on it when I was at FDA, but that CSPI was putting a lot of pressure on FDA from the outside. If you go to a chain restaurant, at least one that has more than 20 uh, outlets, and you see the calorie count, you can say, ah, that was CSPI too, because we pushed for that. And eventually, we got a requirement for that menu labeling to be inserted into the Affordable Care Act, so-called Obamacare. We've also been big on allergy label. There was this bill called FALCPA, the Food Allergy Labeling Act. And then that is what results in some food labels. You'll see it says allergens, and they'll list up to 8 different particular chemicals, actually 9, because we pushed as well to add sesame, and sesame was recently added. So where it says allergen, that's a lot of work goes into just getting that line to be on the label. And the warnings on alcohol are frankly fairly pathetic. There's a warning about pregnant women and something about being dangerous to your health, literally no more than that. There's no specificity to it. There's no There's nothing on drinking and driving. There's nothing on cancer. It's really quite inadequate. And so we filed a number of petitions that were making good headway under the Biden administration and which are probably coming to a halt under the current administration. So lots more work to be done in alcohol. Um, Things that you won't see because CSPI were involved are trans fat. You saw in the nutrition facts label, the zero line. Trans fat is banned now, and that happened in about 2018 as well. You won't see the same kind of soda and junk food in school meals the way you used to. School meals have really improved. And that's because of something we helped to pass called the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act in 2010. We use our litigation team to sue particular private corporations for their false and misleading marketing practices. And we often enter into settlements with them that include a substantive change to the way that they're marketing. We got 7 carcinogenic food flavorings and other chemicals removed from the food supply. We were behind something called the Food Safety Modernization Act, which also passed in 2010, which is all about pathogens in the food supply and preventing those. And then most recently, you might have heard about the ban of Red 3 from foods and drugs. And that was something that we petitioned for and that I literally began working on about 45 years ago. That's how long it can take to get something done in Washington. This slide tells you all the different things that we're working on. Many of them I've already touched upon, but the real point of it is to say that we work in 3 general areas: nutrition, food safety, and I want to emphasize this health portion over here because that goes beyond CSPI's historic interests to get involved in things that are beyond food. And that's something that I've brought from my own history and experience. So we work on medical devices and drugs. We have a whole scientific misinformation project that includes work on vaccines. And we monitor the FDA to make sure that it maintains its standards. And we do so with these strategies, some of which I've already touched on. We do advocacy. So we have a group of lobbyists who work at the federal level, to a lesser extent at the state and local level. We work heavily in the regulatory agencies, especially FDA and USDA. Sometimes, when it's the right thing to do, we engage with corporations and try to convince them to do something. Litigation, I've touched upon. We do a lot of research, and that's unusual for a public interest group. We publish probably a dozen or more peer-reviewed papers a year, which is very unusual, as I say, in public interest. And many of them are primary data collection efforts. We have Nutrition Action, the magazine that Diane subscribes to, and do other work on our website. And increasingly, we're engaging in partnerships with other communities to advance our work. So the second topic then, after talking about CSPI, is to talk about the MAHA movement. And the beginning of that, it originates with this executive order that the president released on February 13th of 2025. And he charged this MAHA commission with studying the scope of childhood chronic disease and the crisis around that and what was causing it. And he asked the commission to provide a set of recommendations. And this effort was to be chaired by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who is the Secretary of HHS, as everybody knows. Members of the commission were people who are members of other cabinet cabinet agencies and other agencies as well, like NIH and FDA. So there were 2 parts to what they were supposed to do. The first part was to release what was called an assessment after 100 days, and followed that 80 days later with a second report, which was called a strategy. So the assessment report came out, well, not 100 days later, but not too far from that, on May 22nd of last year. And it identified these 4 concepts as the major drivers in the childhood chronic disease crisis. Ultra-processed foods, aggregation of environmental chemicals, lack of physical activity, chronic stress and technology use, so screens, and over-medicalization. I'm not here to tell you that these things aren't important. I am here to tell you that is a very unusual way of conceiving of the causes of ill health, especially for chronic disease. And what you would expect to see here is something about guns or cars, tobacco, drug abuse, poor diet, smoking. That's what you would expect to see. But it's put together in this way that, reflects the, predilections of the secretary, by which I mean RFK. So that's the way they put it all together. There were there was quite a bit of misinformation in there, and we'll touch on a little bit of what that is. Um, some of the better ideas, unfortunately, were contradicted by the Trump administration's actions. So when there was a good idea that needed funding, at the same time, the administration was, at the time, especially when this came out, riffing people in the agencies. Doge was especially active. They're getting ready for the so-called Big Beautiful Bill, which ultimately cut back many of these programs. There were contradictions that were kind of built into even the best ideas. And the second one, which I also touch on a little bit as I move on, is that the best ideas were often pro-regulatory ideas. But what you saw instead was a drive toward deregulation. And I'll talk about that more in the strategy report. There were overriding concerns about the report's scientific integrity. I'll get to that in a moment. And there were notable absences of these, excuse me, major causes of ill health: tobacco, alcohol, inequity. You could, control F for those and you'd find absolutely nothing. Um, So many of the secretary's generally unscientific pet peeves were reflected in this assessment. A focus on butter and lard, antipathy toward the so-called seed oils, pushing fluoride and claiming claims of reduced IQ, cancer from electromagnetic radiation, concerns of damage caused by the medical system itself through therapy, mental health programs, so on. Concern that drugs were worsening people's health, drugs particularly for mental health conditions, and then, of course, harms from vaccines. The scientific integrity concerns, it turns out evidently that the report was written before there were any citations, which is not the way things are supposed to be done. It was as if the conclusions had been reached before the evidence to support those conclusions had been assembled. We know that because draft versions of the Maha report were provided to journalists, and it had no citations whatsoever. And then several days later, when the report finally came out, there were citations, but those turned out to be problematic. In fact, many of them had the hallucinations that are common with AI. And there were a good number of those, made absolutely no sense. And actually, CSPI had the distinction of being, I guess I would say, miscited in this report. They actually cited one of our reports, but in an incorrect way. It's hard to know quite what to make of that. But in any case, they was heavily faulted for the sloppiness of the way the report was pulled together. So, Trump being Trump, they put that behind them and move on to the next thing. And the next thing in this context was the strategy report, which I told you was supposed to come a little bit after the assessment report. Here they put things together with these four pillars, they called them: advancing research, private sector collaboration, increasing public awareness, and realigning incentives. Um, so there were a few things in there that were actually potentially positive. One of them was front package labeling, which is the idea of having a summary of the nutrition facts label as it relates to the disadvantageous nutrients, added sugars, sodium, saturated fat in particular, putting them on the front of the pack and identifying whether or not there's too much or a high level of those nutrients in the particular food. They are still talking about doing this. My guess is they will undo the proposal that the Biden administration put out toward the end of its reign, because the antipathy to saturated fat that I'll get into when I talk about the dietary guidelines is probably going to make them want to do this differently than the rest of us would have preferred. They also push for grass reform. Again, I'll touch on this more when we talk about chemicals. I'll just skip over it for now. And similarly, they want to review chemicals after they've been put on the market, and I'll talk about that in the context of chemicals in a little bit as well. A lot of interest in ultra-processed foods, as you can imagine, but Actually, the mention of ultra-processed food in this final report was trivial. And the FDA is trying to define exactly what an ultra-processed food is. And so all they did in terms of a strategy was to say that they would go ahead and define ultra-processed food. So it was actually quite limited. Personally, I happen to think that that's a very important step and a necessary one before one can conduct proper research or be able to regulate these products, or some of them, or at least the most harmful of them. But it was a bit watered down compared to what a lot of people in the MAHA movement were expecting. And there's also stuff in there about direct-to-consumer advertising, which is would be good to take action on, but it's very difficult given the First Amendment that we have in this country. The thing that the report though did have a heavy emphasis on deregulations. Something I touched on before is that the best ideas are that they had in the report are typically pro-regulatory, but this is an administration through OMB, Office of Management and Budget, that is hell-bent on deregulation of any kind. They've even got a proposal that says that for every one new regulation you pass, you have to get rid of 10, irrespective of what they are. So they're heavy into deregulation, and we've seen that. And so broadly, any new attempts at, say, food regulation are going to run into that obstacle over at the OMB. So there were a number of proposals to deregulate in the food area at USDA. All of these are kind of pro-business efforts to deregulate, make drug and device approval easier than it currently is. And then at EPA, a number of the deregulatory efforts that we've seen related to, for example, emissions from power plants that run completely contrary to the ways that the assessment report, for example, says we should focus on chemicals if we're to make America healthier. So, in many respects, both philosophically in terms of the deregulatory and with respect to the particulars of certain deregulatory efforts, the administration is somewhat at war with itself. There's also an emphasis on voluntary action as a consequence. That's a tried and true thing in Republican administrations. So even the much heralded food dye bans are not actually bans. The ban on Red 3 is in fact a ban. We can get into the details of that if you like. But that one is an actual ban. It was done by Biden, not RFK. But the other restrictions on food dyes are purely voluntary. We have a tracker at CSPI that allows us to track them. A good number of companies have not agreed so far to actually take the dyes out. So we'll see what that all eventually comes to. At USDA and EPA, you get language like this: we're empowering farmers and keeping solutions voluntary, all while avoiding burdensome mandates. As far as eating healthy at restaurants, they want to increase education and awareness, as opposed to taking any regulatory action that might actually improve the quality of food. Education is something else that is heavily advertised, but the problem again is that usually takes money. And what we mostly see are a bunch of cutbacks in the education area, including the Department of Education itself, mind you, from the Trump administration. So in health, they've cut something called SNAP Ed, which is something run by USDA to educate people about good nutrition. They they want to educate people about the dietary guidelines, but there's no money for that. As far as pesticides, this was especially interesting because that's a big push in the MAHA movement. But it became quite clear that the pesticide industry got to the people who were writing the MAHA report, whoever they were, because that's not public. And they watered down the strong language in the assessment about pesticides. And all they said in the final strategy report was that there would be public education to ensure awareness and knowledge of how good a job the EPA does in reviewing pesticides. Um, and then, other education campaigns, I won't get into them in more detail, just to say that all of this is a substitute for regulation that might actually make a difference. A few things are missing. I've touched on some of them before. Nothing on inequity, health disparity, social determinants of health. Literally nothing on sodium, literally nothing on added sugars, and nothing substantial to address alcohol, tobacco use, even though they're such important contributors to ill health. mostly education, with no money to go with it. So the third topic, I did promise I would talk about food additives. So here I will. They're more or less four areas that we see as gaps in FDA chemical oversight. The ones in bold are the ones that I'll talk about today, not the science or the funding. Those are kind of a given almost. We're going to talk about GRAS, and for a short while, we'll talk about food chemical reassessment. So GRAS stands for generally recognized as safe. Um, just Sorry. Um, so uh, this is the sort of most technical slide when it comes to the law. It's not very technical, I apologize. So you look at all the chemicals that are in the food supply. You can think of them in two parts. They're the additives and the ones that aren't really additives. Okay, so within the additives category, there's something called a direct additive, and that's what you probably think of as an additive. Some of those things that are in the ingredient list. Many of those are, most of those are, if they're not actual whole foods, then they are direct additives. And we'll talk about how they're regulated in a moment. There's a category called an indirect additive, which is a food contact substance. So that is something that might be in the lining of a can, but might leach into food. Those are called indirect additives. They're regulated in a different way. And then the third category are color additives, which have to get pre-market approval. And if they cause, well, if any of them cause cancer, they're not allowed in the food supply. But color additives, you have to go through a much more elaborate pre-market approval process because it is assumed that there's no real benefit to a color additive except to the company that's using it, because they're merely cosmetic. Now, then there are a bunch of things that may seem to be additives but really aren't. One is anything that was on the market prior to the food additive amendments of 1958. Those are all just grandfathered in and are accepted in the food supply. If a chemical has a drug claim, meaning it claims to treat, prevent, or diagnose a disease, then it's a drug, and it is not supposed to be in the food supply at all. Occasionally it happens, but broadly, anything, a chemical with a drug claim is a drug and it should not be in the food supply. Uh, there are also dietary ingredients that are in supplements. Those are regulated separately. Of course, there are adulterants that aren't supposed to be there at all, like heavy metals or sometimes drugs. All of those are precluded. Pesticides are regulated separately by the EPA for the most part. And then there's grass, generally recognized as safe. And I'll talk about that in more detail in just a minute. So here's how you get to market if you are an additive. Okay. And interestingly, despite all these different the grass process and those there that are listed under the pre-market approval bullet, they are all, at least in theory, subject to the same approval standard. They must be shown to be reasonably certain to do no harm, which is actually quite a high standard if implemented, reasonably certain to do no harm. And irrespective of which pathway you go through, that in principle is the standard that is being implemented. So on the pre-market side, all of those on the previous slide on the left-hand side, um, if you have a regular food additive or a color additive, you have to apply pre-market to the FDA, and they have to give the approval before it can proceed to market. For the food contact ones, if the FDA doesn't respond within a certain period of time, it can come on the market as well. So a bit of a lower standard. For each of these, though, the companies are allowed to retain the information that they submit to FDA as private, which is to say that the rest of us can't see it. And then there's grass. So grass, especially interesting. This was an exception to the 1958 Food and Drug Amendment, the food amendments. Sorry. Um, and the idea was that there were certain things that had just been around, like literally for centuries, that everybody at this point really accepted as safe, and they were thought of as, condiments or essential to cooking. So vinegar, sugar, flour, all those things. And they were thought of as being generally recognized as safe, and there was a separate process for those. What has come to take place is that this provision, the generally recognized as safe provision, which was intended to be the exception. The general way that additives were supposed to come to market was through a direct food additive petition. But instead, over time, this has become the way that most chemicals come to market. And the way it works is that the companies can self-determine that the chemically is generally recognized as safe, according to the standard on the earlier slide of reasonable certainty of no harm. So the companies decide for themselves. They're supposed to only use publicly available data, so that's good. But even once they make that determination that something is safe in their view, they don't have to notify the FDA. It's extraordinary. So there's no requirement for FDA notification. And the result is what we call secret GRAS. Companies can withdraw a GRAS notification, they can determine safety, they can mark the chemical, all of this without telling FDA. So FDA doesn't even know all of the chemicals that are on the market at present. Now, as I said, in theory, grass must meet the same safety standard as if it was a food additive. But in practice, because nobody is necessarily seeing them, and the more and more this is being used, especially the secret grass portion, there's no real oversight, and we don't have any assurance that what's coming to market is safe. As far as the public perception of food chemicals, though, they think FDA is really looking after us much better than, frankly, they are. If you ask people whether or not FDA has tested food additives to determine that they're safe, 84% of people will say yes, even though there's an increasing fraction of foods for which that's false. And if you ask them if a food is generally recognized as safe, 50% will say that FDA has evaluated the ingredient and deemed it to be safe. 29% will say that FDA has been informed that it was safe. And 32% will say that FDA is keeping track of safety and use over time. None of those things are true. So the public is under great misperception of the extent of FDA oversight in this area. So just the final thing on the area of food additives then is food chemical reassessment. And just to mention that CSPI, so sorry, this is the idea that a chemical is on the market and maybe there's a safety issue that arises after it's on the market. Maybe it was reviewed by FDA, maybe it came through under GRAS, who knows? But whatever reason, literature arises that raise questions about the chemical and what does FDA do in reassessing that. So you are allowed to file a petition yourself to remove additives from the market. FDA has done that. Red 3 was one of those. And that's how we got it removed. We've also filed one on titanium dioxide and on synthetic color additives. FDA has had a reorganization after an infant formula outbreak a couple of years ago, which has probably improved the situation somewhat. It's forced more of a focus on chemicals, which again, the MAHA people are especially interested in. They're frankly more interested in chemicals than they are in nutrients. Which in fact, the larger cause of death in this country is nutrients, not chemicals. So they have it exactly wrong, but their focus is very much on chemicals. But all of this has elevated food within FDA, and that's probably a good thing. They also are developing their own post-market reassessment plan, which we have commented on and is broadly, pretty good. And then there are a number of bills that are in the Congress that would reform things. Most of them are probably not going anywhere. One of them is a reassessment bill, and these two are things that would close the GRAS loophole. Okay, so on to the final topic, which is the recently released dietary guidelines for Americans, which means this very month. And I'll talk about how those came to be, and then we'll stop for questions. So I'll touch on what they are, how they're developed, what has changed compared to previous dietary guidelines, why, and why it matters. So here's just a little background on the dietary guidelines and how they work. They're jointly developed by USDA and HHS. They have two audiences, and we'll touch on this as well. One is you as a consumer, as an eater, to your nutrition advice. And the second is a series of policy programs, nutrition programs, feeding programs that depend on these dietary guidelines because they're supposed to reflect them in terms of what they serve to their clients. So the way it works is, as I'll explain in a little bit more detail, there's a Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, which is convened um, more than 2 years before the dietary guidelines come out. These are very high-level academics from around the country, and they put together a report that serves as the scientific underpinning for the recommendations that they issue. So you end up with this uh, you end up with this report from the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee that I'll call DGAC. And all of this, their report is the scientific underpinning, as I've said, for all these programs and educational practices and so forth. They're supposed to come out every 5 years, and that has been the case since 1980. And as the last one just came out on January 7th. And we've really said this last point already. So here's the DGAC process. What they do is they identify a series of scientific questions. HHS and USDA do that. There are nominees that are put forth to be on the DGAC, and the public gets to nominate and comment. When the DGAC is put together, it's about 20 people. They review the evidence using data analysis, food pattern modeling, and a systematic review. So it was very elaborate, thousands and thousands of pages with many, meta-analyses and other kinds of systematic reviews that are all part of it. It's a very elaborate answering, these questions that were identified up here. So then there are a series of public meetings. They occur all around the country. You can stand up and testify at those. And then ultimately, the DGAC produces its scientific report. Now, all of those ones over there are in bold because they're open to public comment and involvement. But at the point that the DGAC report is produced, and again, it's this massive tome, right, with all this technical scientific information. At that point, that information is handed over to USDA and HHS, and they just write the report right from there. Okay, it's an advisory committee, so they're not obligated to follow the advice provided by the DGAC, but as a general matter, they do. So in the previous DGA, dietary guidelines, in the previous one, all but two of the significant recommendations of the DGAC were adopted by the final DGA. And even those were only not adopted in part, I would say. So there's usually a close correspondence between the DGA-C and the DGA. Now, as fate would have it this time, the DGA-C provided its report in December of 2024, right as the Biden administration was leaving, and they handed it over to what was soon to become a new HHS and USDA. And so it was, completely, just happened to be the way the timing worked out. So this administration, right off the bat, just rejected most of what they had to say. They said that the American public deserves dietary guidance grounded in the best available science. We'll see if they did that. Free from ideological bias. We'll see if they did that. Free of institutional conflict. We'll see if they did that. Or any predetermined conclusions. Well, yeah, you can imagine. So one of the reasons that the DGAC report was rejected was because the DGAC talked a lot about health equity. That's not consistent with the current administration. So that was a large part of why they just rejected almost everything. I'll skip that point. So what they did instead was they put together a different group of people. So instead of this scientific report from the DGAC going here, what you got instead was a new group that was comprised of 9 people. Now, Secretary Kennedy has made a big noise about how advisory committees, both for food and for vaccines, are rife with conflict of interest. I actually wrote a paper in the JAMA showing that for the vaccine advisory committees at both FDA and CDC, that is not true. They have actually very low conflict rates. And here again, we heard about conflict with respect to the DGAC, and there was some, I have to say, there were probably 9 out of 20 people who had some kind of conflict. They put together 9 people to put together this scientific foundation, they called it, and 7 out of 9 of them had conflict, so much higher rate than for the Biden group, mostly with the meat and dairy industries or with the supplement industry. And you can see the impact of that when the report eventually came out. So this is what they produced. This rather, in my estimation, amateurish looking food pyramid. They were very focused on the food pyramid. For some reason, Secretary went on about the food pyramid. The strange part about it is the food pyramid was abandoned about 10 years ago, and instead was something called My Plate. So kind of a flat plate with four different segments of different sizes that explained how much dairy you should have, how much protein, how much added sugar, how much saturated fat. And so what they've done in kind of classic Trumpian fashion is they've actually gone back to the way it used to be for no good reason, taken the pyramid again, and then in again classic Trumpian fashion turned it on its head, which for some reason gives them satisfaction. So that is what you get. You get a bunch of cheap clip art that is pulled together in this very hard to interpret food pyramid. For some reason, whole grains are right down here at the bottom. I presume this is some predilection for Atkins style diets, even though, in fact, the new dietary guidelines are pretty good on whole grains. But in this pyramid, it's way down at the bottom. The real take home message from this pyramid is that you see red meat here way up at the top and milk over here, which is whole milk. These are very much, cheese is here, butter is high. All these things are pushed eggs, are all pushed toward the top of the pyramid because that's the new drive in the new dietary guidelines. With respect to fruit and vegetables, it's about the same as it was, except the old one had specifics about different kinds, different subgroups of vegetables, and the new people don't seem to be interested in that, so they took out those distinctions. Also, when they talk about protein, they always talk about animal protein before plant protein. So the tone of the entire thing is, and in this graphic, is to push meat and dairy products because they don't trust the restriction on saturated fat, I suppose, except, ironically, the restriction on saturated fat that has been in the last four dietary guidelines is carried through in the new one, such that only 10% of calories are supposed to be in saturated fat. That's always been the case. They didn't actually change it. So for all of the rhetoric about red meat and the like, the saturated fat level is the same. Now, the only problem with that is I mentioned that the old DGAs used to do something called dietary pattern modeling. These folks didn't do that. So they didn't detect that if you actually were to take the number of servings of red meat and cheese, whole milk, butter, so on, it actually would be extremely difficult to comply with the saturated fat level that they recommended. So there's a kind of internal contradiction. Okay, we talked about that. The DGAC report that had been so exhaustively compiled was mostly rejected. 54% was rejected. I told you the last time almost everything was accepted. So only 25% were accepted, and about a quarter was, partially accepted. There's no real dietary pattern. I spoke to that. Already that's where you try to figure out how all of the nutrient recommendations fit together in a single pattern. Didn't do that, and we've talked about the problem with saturated fat. So the key issues with the science behind the new DGA are that there was no transparency at all, because they, started from after the issuance of the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee report and made their own committee. There was nothing that occurred in the public at all. The different chapters that were written in what's only a 90-page report used inconsistent standards of evidence and not standards of evidence that were as high as the DGAC. Many of them were what are called narrative reviews. There was not a meta-analysis to be seen. Much weaker than the quality from the DGAC. And as I mentioned, more prone to conflict of interest. No comprehensive food patterning modeling. There was a big focus on extremely athletic people, which I take to be the secretary telling us that we should all be more like him, doing pull-ups in National Airport. I take it that's what that means because in a couple of places this comes through. One is the protein recommendations, again, high in animal protein, are greatly in excess of what has historically been recommended. Most of what, if you exceed the protein requirements, which almost everybody does already, it'll just get eliminated in your urine or converted into glucose or fat. But people who are lifting weights and exercising heavily, they actually do need more protein. So it's as if the heavy exercisers, their concerns have sort of leaked into the report as opposed to something that's supposed to be for the general public. Same thing is true for the sodium requirements. They keep the same sodium requirements, but very grudgingly. So, having said that the sodium requirements are the same, they try to say, well, you might need a little bit more if you're a heavy exerciser, and that you should, salt your food if preferred. So they kind of, undermine themselves within their own report. There's not a lot of interest in sodium, even though, the first FDA commissioner under the last Trump administration correctly identified sodium as the single most important nutrient in terms of making a difference in morbidity and mortality in this country. Usual blatant errors, so on. So the final point that I just want to make, and then I will stop, is I said at the beginning that DGAs are important because they provide nutrition advice, and we've gone through it and explained the poor scientific basis for some of it and the internal contradictions. But probably, the sad fact of the matter is that the DGAs are not that closely followed. The people consume more added sugar, more saturated fat, um, more sodium than they should. And whether or not a new DGA will actually change things, I rather suspect it will have only limited impact. Where it really does matter, though, is all of these programs that are required to comply with the DGA, at least in general. And these include the WIC program for women and children, the National School Lunch Program, which serves 29 million students a day and had been changing to get still healthier in stages to comply with the DGA right after we passed that Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act, programs for older Americans, programs for the military. All of these things are supposed to reflect the DGA. And I think it's reasonable to expect that all of those programs will be re-examined now that they've got a kind of new Bible. And I don't think it will be in a direction that will actually make Americans healthier. So with that, I'll stop and I'll stop sharing, and we can go to any questions that folks might have.
Well, let me just first thank you for that very impressive talk, and it's so comprehensive. I'm sure everyone learned something, but I do see we have a hand up, and I think we have a few questions in the chat. But Mr. Kunstler, I see you have a hand up.
Yes, thank you for taking the time, and I'm really glad you talked about grass because I'm a little bit grass obsessed, and I have some questions about it, and I've been doing a lot of research on it. And I relied heavily on a CSPI publication.
Good.
Um, One of my questions is, why do you say that the Better FDA Act, the one that will essentially make not only grass notification mandatory, but approval for grass substances mandatory, is unlikely to go anywhere?
Well, it's unlikely to go anywhere because it's here's the maybe I let me step back for a moment. There's a great thing about the Maha movement, which is it's got people to think about food at all. Okay, food is usually an afterthought. If you, are ever, up for being FDA commissioner, they pay almost no attention to what you've done on food. And if you've done nothing on food, that's not going to cut you out. If you have done nothing on drugs, on the other hand, you're out. So food has always been an afterthought at FDA, and I say that as somebody who worked there. And food in general has not been part of the national debate in the way that it should. And the Maha people have managed to make that happen. The problem, though, and some of the ideas are good, particularly in the chemical area, the grass would be good, reassessment would be good. The problem is it comes up against two things, very powerful and inconsistent with what the Maha movement wants to do. And I think for the most part will mean that they're, in the end, will probably be largely ineffective. The one is that industry doesn't like it, right? They don't like a lot of what's proposed, and they do not want to see the end of the grass loophole because that's how they bring chemicals to market. So the industry is not going to stand for that. The same reason they're not going to stand for a bill that would do that passing in the Congress. I mean, we're going to keep trying. Don't get me wrong. And if there was ever a moment where it might happen, it's probably now. But the industry is going to come out, kicking and screaming. Remembering too that there's a lot going on at the state level. I didn't touch on that at all, where there's a lot of activity, especially with respect to chemicals. So the industry, for example, has created something called AFIT, Americans for Ingredient Transparency, which is the very antithesis of transparent. Its object is to pass a preemption bill at the national level that would prevent any of the state bills that have been banning chemicals from taking place. So the industry is the first obstacle. And the second one I did touch on is the ideological orientation of the Trump administration itself, which is anti-regulatory. And closing the grass loophole and making people file food additive petitions is, without question, pro-regulatory. So I think there are limits. Something is pending at the Office of Management and Budget right now. We know that they've sent a grass reform bill up to OMB. We don't know what's in it. You can grade a grass bill on two scales. The first is, does it require notification that FDA just knows what's coming to market? That should be the bare minimum. Um, and the second, more difficult to get, is does it require enhanced pre-market review? And you can have the first without the second. You can't really have the second without the first. But so we'll see what they've actually proposed. And then, of course, there will come a notice and comment period. We'll be in there, but you can be sure industry will be too. And they'll be meeting with OMB left and right and trying to water the whole thing down. So, it's a battle. It's Washington. It's the way it goes. But I think that there's some built-in checks on what the Maha movement can do as a result. And we see that, by the way, in those Maha reports, that most people in the Maha movement saw the the second report, right, the strategy, as disappointing. That there was a lot of education. The stuff on grass was namby-pamby. The stuff on UPFs just talked about definitions. The stuff on pesticides, instead of saying that glyphosate should be banned, which is what the first report said that what you should do is educate the public about what a great pesticide review process EPA has. I mean, gosh, how did they ever pull that off? So those are my reasons. It's a long answer to your question. I'm an optimist. I keep trying, but it's a pretty steep hill.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions that are a little bit more broad and I think might answer a question in the chat. And first is, I wonder if you have any insights into what's going on behind the scenes at HHS and regulation of food. I mean, it seems like there's a good deal of industry involvement and that a lot of the pushes are based on industry. But then there are things that just I'm not sure they are, and I'm wondering where they're coming from. And like you gave us some examples in the beginning in the Maha reports and about things that were potentially positive, but then I don't know, it doesn't seem like they're going to go forward. So it seems like there's some tension and in the administration, I don't know, between Kennedy and the deregulatory focus. So that's one. A second one is, I mean, CSPI is involved in a lot. I mean, you use a lot of legal tools to influence policy. And so I'm wondering across your years, what do you think have been the most effective? It sounds like you do a lot of citizen petitions, and I don't know how much you get involved in litigation, you comment on regulations. So I'm kind of interested in your answers to that.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's good. So, on the first, yeah, I mean, I think I sort of touched on it. I mean, the way in which industry can get in and stymie things, but it's even a bit more complicated than that because the Maha movement itself has internal contradictions, or at least internal tensions. It's sort of divided in two, the food people and the vaccine people. And the food people aren't really interested in vaccines, and the vaccine people aren't really interested in food. And I think that the moms, right, the so-called, well, some of them are getting fed up because they feel that the vaccine stuff is actually progressing in their terms. It's certainly not in mine, but in their terms, there's movement there, but the food stuff is going a lot slower. So they're frustrated. They think that the vaccine, people are getting, sort of an advantage. Um, and then, there's concern in the White House that the vaccine stuff is actually endangering the food stuff, right? Because the vaccine, broadly speaking, for all that we read in the papers about the havoc that they're wreaking with respect to the vaccines, vaccines are actually popular in this country. Let's not forget that. I mean, there's an anti-vax movement, but upwards of 90% of parents vaccinate their children at the end of the day. So, the vaccines, from the White House point of view, is a losing issue. And he keeps pushing that. And meantime, the food people are frustrated because the vaccine stuff is not, is taking up all the air. So there are a lot of tensions for them to work out, and that's why it comes out, kind of the sporadic way that it sometimes does. Let me answer your legal question, and I'll answer this actually kind of in historical fashion. When I came to CSPI, there was a lot of focus on class action litigation, and we used to bring these false and misleading claims, deceptive claims that I alluded to at the beginning of my presentation. And we got a bunch of things changed. There are obviously food lawyers who will settle for cash, and I'm not saying that we don't get some attorney's fees. We do, not very large, but we do get some. But we always insist on, substantive relief as well. And that usually means a change in a claim. So for example, we sued Cheez-Its. We said that they had a whole wheat Cheez-It. You could tell from the ingredient list, which lists ingredients in descending order of their prevalence, that it was not even 50% of the ingredient because it wasn't the first ingredient, right? The first ingredient is the only one that can be 50%, right? So, it was not number one, and therefore it was not 50%. It was something, but nonetheless they called it whole wheat. So we sued them over that, and we got them to change it, and we even created some precedent by winning at the appellate court as well. So we used to bring those kinds of cases, and that used to be what our litigation department did. When I came in, we took another look at it, and we decided that while we would continue to do some of those cases, and we do, we would rather focus on regulatory law. So as you said, we do file a lot of petitions, and then you can obviously sue for unreasonable delay in responding to them, or sometimes under the arbitrary and capricious standard, if the relief that you get is considered arbitrary and capricious, you can get things overturned. That's very difficult. But on procedural grounds, you stand much better chance. So we've sort of moved much more into the Administrative Procedure Act side of the law, and I don't regret that at all. I'll tell you about our most exciting victory of the last year. We filed a lawsuit against the National Institute of Health. You'll remember that fairly early on in the Trump administration, they started terminating these grants because gender ideology or DEI or there was this vaccine hesitancy, or since you mentioned I'm from South Africa, they stopped funding anything that had anything to do with South Africa. Um, so we brought a lawsuit um, on behalf of a number of researchers who had seen their grants terminated. Ironically, one of them was me. I was on a grant with some people up at Harvard for a completely trivial amount. I was like on for a meeting or two at $150 a piece, but that was enough for me to allege damage and get me standing to sue in the case. And there were others who were in for
Mhm.
millions, but I was a plaintiff myself. And we took the case all the way up to the Supreme Court. And those grants have been restored. Close to $1 billion of grants have been restored as a result of that lawsuit. So, all of it was because NIH had a set of processes that governed the conditions under which they could terminate a grant. And as we determined through discovery, they did not follow them. So, for example, email trail established that there was an email from some, joking here, 23-year-old over at Doge, sends an email to the acting head of the NIH. Attached, please find a list of grants that are to be terminated. And there's an Excel spreadsheet. It's very long, hundreds of grants. And 2 minutes later, the guy writes back, terminated. And that was that. 2 minutes. You can make an argument that that's arbitrary and capricious. And if you make that argument, you'll find a judge that will buy it. And that's what happened. So many of those grants have since been restored. It's not over. Some of it was, had to do with, temporary injunctions and stays and the like. So it's all been sort of relitigated again and moving its way back up the courts. But at least in the short term, we got all of those grants restored. So that's the tool that at this point we're most focused on.
That's great. Thank you for that. So we've come to the end of our time, but I want to thank you again for incredibly informative and thought-provoking talk. I also want to thank all of you for making time to join us today, and I extend our gratitude to Karen Rothenberg, whose generosity makes this speaker series possible, and to Jihan Gergis, our health loss program specialist, from doing everything behind the scenes to make this happen. And we hope that you have a warm and productive start to your year and semesters, and hope you'll join us again on April 30th when we will conclude this year's series with Dr. Reshma Ramachandran, who's an assistant professor and board-certified family physician and health services researcher at the Yale School of Medicine. Dr. Ramachandran will discuss the implications for patients and public health of FDA's curtailed authority to regulate lab-developed tests. So look for an email from us and a chance to register for that event soon. Again, thanks everyone for joining. Take care.